Thank you very much for purchasing the DVD of my talk about the album Dangerous. I am very happy to share with you some of my university research that I did in France on Michael Jackson's album Dangerous, with a particular emphasis on the creation of the album jacket designed by the famous pop artist Mark Ryden. The album Dangerous is, for me, as it is for most fans I believe, an album that has always been both intriguing and disturbing because of its avant-garde sound. Both the painting by Mark Ryden as well as the album cover itself are so dense and so rich that they create a feeling of fascination and mystery. Here are a few of the various aspects I have analyzed and presented in my book called Pop Culture at the Pantheon of Fine Arts, Dangerous from Mark Ryden to Michael Jackson, published by L'Harmattan in French and by Delatour in English. The pictures that you can see on the album jacket of Dangerous are symbolic and coded, which appeal to many different populations so that it is accessible to both the general public and to those who are more culturally inclined. Mark Ryden uses quotations from works of art and offers hidden messages that are simultaneously both of his time, the 90s, but which are also timeless. This piece of art, like everything else produced by the painter Mark Ryden and the singer Michael Jackson, can be seen as a fusion of generally opposite concepts, like a paradox. Examples of these opposites include appealing simultaneously both to the highly educated populations and to the less educated, being about the past but also about the present, and being entertaining but also being an artistic creation. Their creation targets a broad cross-section of mankind and creates an awareness which went beyond specific cultures and trends. The artwork of the album cover transposes or completes Michael Jackson's process of musical creation, which, generally speaking, and even more so on this particular album, goes beyond musical categories, drawing from different styles which range anywhere from classical music to rap, which expand the notion of sound, which abolish the boundaries between all the different musical sounds such as the voice, different instruments, and the use of noise in general. And in Michael Jackson's lyrics, he tackles a cross-section of family, social, and environmental issues. So, as his musical productions are always full of detail, they are works of perfection. They are always long-term projects. 6 albums in 30 years. This is the same for Mark Ryden's painting, which took him 5 months to create. In order to re-establish the visual interest of the Dangerous album through the history of vinyl record jackets, we need to remember how they became an artistic, commercial and sociological medium in their own right. There were 3 different mediums used to create the album jacket: artistic, commercial and sociological. The first type of medium was an artistic medium, because the record jackets were often created by painters or photographers. These artworks sometimes demanded in-depth research. The second type of medium was a commercial medium, because the recognition of the jacket's impact on the record-buying consumers led to the creation of dedicated departments for record labels to deal with just record covers. The labels sometimes worked in association with a particular designer. The third type of medium was a sociological medium, because they are true eyewitness snapshots which reflect the nature and the behavior of society. At the same time, they are visual allegories of the sound content of the album and also a fragment of the essence of the artist, a tangible link between the artist and his or her audience. The commercial value of the design of the artwork of the album covers became important back in the early 40s. And it was exactly the same for the music videos of the 80s. Both the album covers and the musical videos were exploited by talented marketeers with the ability to successfully capture the public's attention. Alex Steinweiss was a pioneer in this field. He was the art director at Columbia Records from 1939 to 1943 and a former poster designer. He created a visual identity for Columbia Records, which became a major factor in the success of the Columbia brand and which was quickly copied by Decca and RCA Records. His artwork used a hand-lettered typography and pictures of the instruments or musical notes rather than photographs of the artist. Steinweiss designed over 2,500 album covers for Columbia and subsequently for Decca and Remington. But the visual evolution of record covers was also influenced by the work of a number of small record producers, including Blue Note and Pacific Jazz, who used designers who had quite radical tendencies, such as Red Miles and William Claxton. In the 60s, we began to see record labels starting to use external designers and photographers instead of in-house designers. Some of them even signed partnership agreements such as Hypnosis with the Pink Floyd, even when they had their own in-house design department, sometimes called a creative studio in the United States. From this point onwards, artists were consulted before their album covers were designed. The arrival of music videos in the early 80s resulted in a shift in investments in favor of these short promotional videos, which could cost up to, particularly in the case of Michael Jackson's short films, several $100,000. Similarly, when we began to see compact discs arrive on the market back in '82, these small CDs caused a lot of fear to the album cover designers because of their small size. They were afraid this would mean less work for them. From that point onwards, the design of the artwork was no longer the subject to whims and exorbitant expenses. We have to remember that an album cover such as the one designed for Dangerous questions the established categories that are usually applied to art and culture. Is it folk art? In other words, is it accessible to everyone? Is it easy to understand? Is it commercial and flashy? The answer is yes, it is. The next question we have to ask ourselves is it a form of pop art which has become trivial through its proliferation and the mass distribution of its medium? Again, the answer is yes, it is. Then, it is a unique work of art, since the original piece of art created by an American artist is a painting measuring about 3 feet by 3 feet, which has rarely been exhibited to the public. Again, the answer is yes, it is. Is it a cultural piece of art, or is it entertainment? It's both. Certainly, Michael Jackson's work, and in particular the album Dangerous that we are looking at here, which sold nearly 12 million copies worldwide, is at the heart of these social and cultural questions. This artist's audience is vast and eclectic like never before. The audience is made up of a wide range of people, different races, different social classes, different generations, and thus people coming from very diverse cultural backgrounds. Some of the members of the audience who listen to Michael Jackson's albums and who have gone to his concerts also go to classical music concerts and to opera, and they also visit museums. In much the same way, by its nature as a unique painting, by the skills of its creator, and by its underlying artistic and cultural references and messages, the Dangerous album jacket stretches over this entire cultural scale, with high culture positioned at one end and low culture at the other end, as established a long time ago by critics. Technically speaking, the Dangerous album is the replica of a painting done in acrylics. It was completed in 5 months by the American artist Mark Ryden, with the original size being about 3 feet by 3 feet. Mark Ryden, who had already worked with Sony Music's artistic director Nancy Donald, was assigned by the Sony label to work on this project with Michael Jackson. However, besides their simple and casual relationship, the two artists shared a common artistic vision. When Mark Ryden first met with Michael Jackson, he cynically commented, "I suppose the thing most people don't know, and what surprised me, was how normal Michael Jackson was in person. His public image is so strange, I did not know what to expect. But when I met with him, we had a very typical and relaxed conversation. We had many common interests we talked about. Maybe I'm just a freak also." Michael Jackson loved Ryden's approach and his way of looking back on circus posters of the previous century. Michael was very appreciative of the artistic symbols and of the Renaissance. He also loved Ryden's art of codifying, which was inspired by this era. Two general guidelines were laid down for this painting. A. The mysterious nature that was to cover the whole design of the artwork, and B. The environmental issues that Michael Jackson was very closely attached to. Both of these elements had to be made apparent. These recent ecological issues that had been sadly popular since the 90s had been marked by a growing awareness of the reduction of the ozone layer and intensive deforestations that were taking place at the time, and which led to the Rio Earth Summit in '92 and then to the Kyoto Protocol in '97. Let us continue to examine how the Dangerous album cover has borrowed ideas from the artists Hieronymus Bosch and Bruegel the Elder. It is the art of combining single elements and multiple elements, bringing them together into one painting with an unending scope that leads to hours of scrutiny. It also borrows from the filmmaker Jim Blashfield a world of pop surrealism that is both sinister and cynical, diverting objects from their primary function. And finally, it makes reference to the artists Botticelli, Bouguereau, Ingres, Cecil Beaton, and Gilles Guérin. In its composition, the Dangerous album artwork derives as much from painting as it does from architecture. Indeed, the sensation of visual proximity to the point of feeling crushed forces the observer to see and to confront the scene and the situation. However, the painting gives you a sort of miraculous architectural sensation with a horizontal 3D-like perspective and depth. But who is Mark Ryden? Mark Ryden was born in 1963 in Medford, Oregon. He holds a BA in Fine Arts and he currently lives and works in Los Angeles in a studio that he himself compares to a cabinet of curiosities. Indeed, it's heaped full of things that is picked up at art sales or general markets, things like all sorts of unrelated objects, such as antique toys, statues, books, trinkets, and so on. But he finds that they all have a sort of invisible coherence. His artistic approach has been inspired by the techniques and the perspectives of the art masters from the 15th and 16th centuries, especially, as we will see, with Hieronymus Bosch and Bruegel the Elder. But he has also been inspired by 19th and 20th century artists. Mark Ryden has been involved with the American pop surrealist movement too. His artwork, of which Dangerous is an interesting microcosm, puts a lot of emphasis on rhythm and combines kaleidoscopic prisms, distortions of scale, and disturbing juxtapositions that betray a certain artistic transposition of the fear of emptiness. This demands a fair amount of visual skill on the part of the viewer. Mark Ryden plays with the subconscious and the collective memory. His work illustrates disturbing, bewitching words, mixing magical realism with irrationality, and his work has been inspired by surrealism, Dadaism, and naive art, and it can be characterized by the rejection of social constraints and the supremacy of dreams and the imagination. Mark Ryden consciously chooses subjects with cultural connotations. His animals are sometimes wild, sometimes fantastic, and sometimes in the form of cuddly toys. His synthetic symbols and religious icons, his strange landscapes and blocks of flesh challenge the eyes and the intellect through their own peculiarity, but he also achieves this feeling through introducing familiar and comforting elements within disturbing contexts. If he goes beyond merely juggling with the languages of art history, Western religions, and popular culture, the artist separates or takes his sources apart and then builds them back together again, but in an innovative way, a new manner of looking at old and or popular information. In much the same way that Michael Jackson never left the entertainment and pop fields, Mark Ryden has elevated, with the design of the Dangerous album artwork, to a traditional feature of mass communication, the album cover, and has raised it to the status of a complex work of art. Dangerous is the fourth album in Michael Jackson's adult solo career. The cover of the first of the four albums, Off the Wall in 1979, was a photograph taken by Mike Salisbury, symbolizing the title and the musical message of the album, namely breaking through the wall of stylistic and racial classifications that marked the US record industry. In this respect, one of the versions of this cover highlights Michael Jackson's feet and legs having him pose like Fred Astaire in a tuxedo instead of highlighting his face or the color of his skin. The cover of Thriller in '82 also focuses on the image of the singer, an image often seen as an opposite image of its predecessor, of the wall, in terms of whether he's dancing or seated comfortably, and in terms of the color of his clothing and skin color. In the Thriller album, he appears relaxed. He is dressed in a white suit and a black shirt. And this time he's not dancing, but he looks self-assured, comfortably seated, leaning on his arm, with his legs stretched out, like a young black artist who is now well established at the peak of the white mainstream music movement. Next, the album Bad in '87 gives Michael Jackson a streetwise and androgynous image that was to make the headlines in all the news at the expense of the more specialized musical and artistic reviews of this essential album. But with Dangerous in '91, the artist was no longer in the picture on the album cover. The rumors relating to Barnum started here, which he may or may not have started himself. His refusal to reveal anything about his private life to the press, fooling the reporters and playing hard to get, encouraged the media to exaggerate and even to invent controversial stories about him to provide headlines for the front page of their newspapers. By '91, Michael Jackson had had enough. He had already sung about this 4 years earlier in the song Leave Me Alone. Jim Blashfield directed the music video of this song, and we will see how this video was a major source of inspiration for Mark Ryden's painting. With Dangerous, Michael Jackson has disappeared from the album cover altogether, except for his eyes, which stare straight into those of the observer, precisely inviting the viewer to look at the world and all its current problems. Dangerous is a bridge to fine arts. To add just a few words about Michael Jackson's recordings, this situation is not an isolated case amongst his music album artworks. Indeed, Dangerous is one of a group of artistic pictures used and commissioned during his career. For example, the artwork on the Jackson's cover for the album Destiny, an anonymous 1978, already presented an initial adaptation of the biblical story of the flood. And then, again in '87, for his album Bad, Michael Jackson had another idea to make a connection with the arts, being inspired by photos of the actress Gloria Swanson, taken back in 1924 by Edward Station. However, this project was rejected by Sony. Dangerous is also a step towards the technological evolutions and processes that were to be put into effect in creating the 3D statue featured on the cover of the next album, History, Past, Present and Future, in '95. A statue inspired by another historic monument, the huge Motherland Coals in Volgograd in Russia. Finally, Michael Jackson's ultimate artistic demand, which was also aborted like the Greg Gorman snapshot for Bad, which consisted of photo shots taken by the fashion photographer Arnaud Bany, was also rejected. There were artistic photos that were something in between traditional and futuristic photos that Michael Jackson wanted for his last opus, Invincible, in 2001. Inspired by the photograph taken by Arnaud Bany, entitled The Sphinx, that made the headlines of the Sunday Times and that Michael Jackson immediately loved, this photo project was, however, abandoned. The cover of the Dangerous album is one of these particular artworks with an aesthetic extravagance that we can all remember. Thus, it's not unlike the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, created by the artist Peter Blake back in '67. Furthermore, this later album of the Beatles marks a departure from the group's previous albums. There's a good reason for this. The album was designed as an album by Sgt. Pepper's Band, not by the Beatles. And for the first time, each Beatle had his own hairstyle, his own costume, his own identity. In fact, it is a family portrait showing the characters they wanted to pay tribute to, because the Beatles wouldn't have been the Beatles without these characters. The artist didn't use a photo montage, but life-size cardboard cut-out statues. When we look at this album, it is as if we are attending, with the new Beatles and their distinguished guests, a kind of funeral where the old Beatles are frozen in their wax effigies. Designing this set was a major job, with a final cost of 3,000 liras, 100 times more expensive than the usual cost. An anecdote: Blake would have preferred to design the cover for the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds rather than this one for the Beatles, simply because he was very poorly paid for it. We find echoes of this in artwork created for Brian Wilson, former leader of the Beach Boys, many years later. Each brief sketch illustrates the title of a song. The Dangerous album cover is certainly a richer and more symbolic cover than the Beatles or Beach Boys album covers, in that it masks a whole lot more. It exceeds the limit of two levels of understanding for a complex and multi-layered approach. We will come back to this point in greater detail a little later. In addition to this characteristic of richness, we all know of some record covers which, like Mark Ryden's, have borrowed and quoted from other works of art. Here are a few examples. In 1969, the Jeff Beck Group reproduced René Magritte's painting The Listening Room. In 1976, Rod Stewart took inspiration from the famous Bal du Moulin de la Galette by Renoir, created 100 years earlier. In 1977, the cover of Music for Pleasure by The Damned was created by an English designer with a radical style, Barney Bubbles, who clearly borrowed ideas from the artists Joan Miro and Wassily Kandinsky. In the same year, the cover of Black Sabbath compilation, Greatest Hits, took its inspiration from Bruegel the Elder, dating back to 1562, with The Triumph of Death. Finally, in the same year that Dangerous came out, Guns N' Roses used detail from the fresco Athens School by Raffaello, revamped here by Mark Kotzebue from the album Use Your Illusion. But Dangerous presents a particularity because it combines quotations from many different works of art, but without any obvious connection to their style or to their subject. Mark Ryden's work raises these artworks to a status which goes beyond the cliché that characterized some of Warhol's diversions. He has assembled different artistic references which in turn tell a new story, which make them coherent and which justify their assortment. Now to get down to the heart of the matter. The Dangerous album cover, as we have mentioned, allows us to analyze the artwork on several different levels. The first level is the easiest one to interpret. It is a treasure hunt surrounding Michael Jackson. First of all, the eyes of the observer in the picture inside the heart of the fresco of the album cover are looking at both the direct and indirect references made to the singer and to his world. In fact, Michael Jackson had been familiarizing his audiences with certain codes since 1978, using a symbolic imagery to which he had initially given them the keys to understand. These codes are given a central place in the visual settings with symbolic elements such as the peacock, the eye, the number 7, or the white glove. As in any system of codes, each element can take on several meanings, and this can sometimes even be seen as a contradiction. Michael Jackson often gives these symbols a more personal sense and orchestrates them skillfully, transferring all its substance to his message, positioning himself as a missionary at the center. But these symbols also allow him to raise questions about the mystery, the same mystery that is ever present in his own artistic life, and that makes it possible to leave these questions up in the air. This is done to arouse individual and collective reflections on social issues, and also to leave freedom of interpretation that aims to reach out to the most diverse group of people. So, at first glance, we can see Michael Jackson, who is directly portrayed in the picture. His eyes, the child on the merry-go-round, the tiny MG as an adult behind the dwarf. Fans looking at the picture will then be able to rapidly pick out, or even at the same time, recognize the indirect symbols, such as the glove, the sticky plasters on the fingers, the armband, the color of the skin, the initials on the sandal, the name of EO, the first 4D and Dolby Sound film created for Disneyland in 1986. The familiar world of Michael Jackson is also present here. The world of childhood, with the inclusion of child stars and friends, like Macaulay Culkin or Shirley Temple. Ben the Rat, which was a reference to the song and the film released in '72, and also to his own pet rat when he was a child. His monkey Bubbles. And finally Neverland, illustrated here by an amusement park with the animals suggesting his zoo. Digging even deeper into the picture, the eye of an amateur can pick out signs that hold personal symbolism for Michael Jackson. Elements of religious numerology with the number 7, or his signature with its symbolic meanings, the peacock and the eye, but also the character of Barnum, who inspired Michael Jackson for a while in his communication and media manipulation strategies. As an example, let's see what we can find here in this little part of the painting. An image of Michael Jackson inaugurating his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in '84, and also a morbid situation that brings together media manipulation incarnated in Barnum, whose ear cleverly hides a skull and who is wearing a brooch representing one of Michael Jackson's signatures, the anticipation of the apocalypse in 98, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, with the alignment of the planets. It should be noted that the Jacksonian symbolic code can be distinguished from the symbols used by other genres, like heavy metal, for example, which, with its mystical symbols such as the goat, the feather, the eye, the horns, all refer to the cherishing of a closed universe among the public, the sense of belonging to a clan. Conversely, Jackson's symbolism has two notable features. First of all, it is not attached to a specific genre, but rather to a person, his, MG's own person. And secondly, it is extremely transversal, transcultural, and unifying. Finally, it conveys a philosophical, political, and spiritual message that amplifies the notion of a clan, or a group where everyone belongs to a global village. In fact, it is a complete and separate visual universe all of its own. This is all the more interesting here, as it overlaps with Mark Ryden's artwork, which is also symbolic. Indeed, his paintings have plenty of symbols scattered throughout the paintings, such as the eye, the camouflaging of numbers, or the recurrence of characters like Abraham Lincoln, trivial in America until it became used a pop figure and a cliché used in advertisements. Thus, the symbolic language doesn't only establish a common point between the two artists, but it also helps create a common space and gives meaning to their artwork as they have been created by two different minds. Another particularity of Dangerous is that it takes its inspiration from another kind of contemporary and popular production, a music video created by Jim Blatchfield for Michael Jackson in '87, "Leave Me Alone." The video for this song is something in between a film and a surrealist cartoon strip, combining real images and cartoon sketches. It's a combination of a collage and a film which represents MG's chaotic private life as opposed to his public life. Actually, it is the story of Michael Jackson's private life made public. The lyrics to "Leave Me Alone" criticize the newspapers and stand against all the controversial stories that are spread around about the artist. Like the pictures and certain songs of the album, the lyrics invite the press and the public to turn their attention to society's real problems. As director of some of the most adventurous cartoon music videos, Jim Blatchfield takes real everyday objects, newspapers, baby carriages, spatulas, photographs them, and then animates them, making them come alive, so they become metaphorical and bewitching. Through this process of animation, the images appear instantly out of date and abstract, as we can see in this excerpt from a video called "And She Was" by Talking Heads, which was made in '85, 2 years before "Leave Me Alone" was made. But the particular feature of his work with Michael Jackson for "Leave Me Alone" is that Jim Blatchfield had to focus on a single personality. He portrays Michael Jackson's life as an amusement park that is evolving in a somewhat threatening atmosphere. It offers us a perceptive and unexpected insight into Jackson's psychological makeup. He creates two Jacksons here. First, a mischievous child, laughing each time he manages to escape from complicated situations, and then a giant reminding us of Gulliver, who is trapped in a labyrinth of roller coasters and water canals, an adult imprisoned by his own image as an artist, imprisoned by all the newspapers, imprisoned by his childhood fantasies. Many of the elements of this video have been transformed by Mark Ryden, as you can see on the Dangerous album artwork. In the same way as it has already been illustrated in the video Leave Me Alone, Michael Jackson's interest in amusement parks and the circus, he always included circus tricks in his shows and considered collaborating with the Cirque du Soleil during the 2000s. Well, this circus is at the heart of Dangerous. At the beginning of the 90s, Michael Jackson spent his first years in his Neverland ranch, a few years after he had bought it. He planned and organized every single detail of the ranch meticulously. Neverland's spirit of the circus and games can also be found in Dangerous through the set, evoking the base of a circus tent, with a few alcoves with overhanging neon lights, like strings of lights, like Christmas lights. However, these things are even more directly obvious with the presence of Barnum, who played a major role in the modern developments of the circus. We can also see the clowns on white elephants like Jumbo, one of Barnum's own elephants, the so-called albino and mistreated elephant, or even of Tom Thumb, who imitated Napoleon in the English court. The spirit of Neverland is also present in the carousels and with children playing. The Neverland themes also ever present through the numerous animals which, in addition to their important reference to endangered species, also remind us of Michael Jackson's personal zoo with his monkeys, snakes, elephants, peacock, tiger, giraffe, and other species. The isolated Los Angeles location of the ranch, associated with the world of Peter Pan, is often seen as the projection of Michael Jackson's inner self. It's like his search for his lost childhood. But it was a world that Michael Jackson needed in order to resource himself, to use his creativity and find peace away from the Hollywood scene with his sharks and sleazy businessmen. Neverland was also much more than a narcissistic creation. It was a place that was open to fans, to poor and sick children, for whom he organized full-day coach tours, giving them access to everything in the amusement park, the zoo, the gardens, the buildings, and the cinema, without any restrictions. Michael Jackson's love of nature and his hope for a better world can be very clearly seen in Dangerous, by the use of a detail from the famous The Birth of Venus in 1485. Finding an illustration from Botticelli's famous Venus seems almost like a cliché in the work of an artist who claims to belong to the surrealist pop movement. However, it is fully in its place for the symbolic coherence it produces through its astrological dimension, since Venus, too, is a planet with a favorable influence, a bearer of positive virtues, fertility, spring, beauty, and love. Placed here on the left, Venus echoes the positive elements on this part of the painting: living things entering the merry-go-round, picture of the sun, and the down Io, the smiling mask. Thus it counterbalances the image of destruction and pollution of the world of Dangerous, representing either the fossilized relics of an earlier Eden or a glimmer of hope for today. The environmental issues are present in the music of the title track Dangerous, whose demo, from the very beginning, allowed factory noises to be recorded. Things are neither simple nor linear in Michael Jackson's world. The lyrics will finally speak about another kind of danger present in Jackson's world. Women, seducers, and vamps is a recurrent theme, which is still another reminder of his strict faith. Environmental questions are also present in Heal the World, where the concept of the environmental issues intersect with solidarity, brotherhood, care and love for one another. This subject is also very present in a song which was only released on the following album, History, but which had already been recorded in its first version, under the original title of What About Us? But then, later, it became better known as the Earth Song. Let's listen to an excerpt of this song. This song was to lead to the establishment of a charity. Heal the World was a charitable organization founded by Michael Jackson back in '92. The goal of this charity was to obtain medicines and treatments for sick children, to prevent children from being exploited and abused, as well as to stop violence against them, and to fight against world hunger and to help the homeless. Through the Heal the World Foundation, Michael Jackson sent 46 tons of supplies to Sarajevo, which included medicine and educational programs aimed at eliminating alcohol abuse among young people. He donated $1 million to children in need. Behind the scenes, he paid for their organ transplants, their operations, and their medical care. If this kind of association between artists and humanitarian causes is now commonplace, especially through sponsorships, it wasn't so popular back at the time when he was doing it. However, Michael Jackson's involvement in social and humanitarian issues occurred long before it became popular. Ever since he was a child, he contributed to helping both his elementary school and libraries, as well as anonymous entities such as universities, hospitals, orphanages, most of the time without media coverage, always focusing on the struggle against suffering and on educating young people, which is a guarantee for our future and for the Earth's future. In February 2001, Michael Jackson also set up Heal the Kids Foundation, specifically dedicated to the welfare of children and their parents, through a re-education of family life, far from TV screens and video games, asking the government to create a special family day, but unfortunately, this project never saw the light of day. The Dangerous album also contains a spiritual dimension. Indeed, the painting on the album cover is both an object of meditation and a prayer to heal the world, just like the song Heal the World is. It represents a world where we should be there to help each other mutually, where the key idea or word is charity. We can hear this in the lyrics of the song Will You Be There? But we'll talk about this in a little while, where it can also be seen as a tomb or a mausoleum. The spiritual significance was essential in Michael Jackson's work and his manner of functioning. By the time he made the album Dangerous, he was no longer a Jehovah's Witness, as he was when he was younger. He also said he was, at that time, no longer religious, but instead he had become more spiritual, so to say. However, he had already read the Holy Bible several times and annotated it over many years, and he would never have abandoned either this book or Jesus Christ, who was a type of ideal for him. Feeling himself limited in his artistic practices by the demanding and restrictive moral expectations of respectability of this religious context, and at the same time realizing he had to choose in an extreme manner between the church, his family, and his artistic freedom, he decided to abandon these chains which restricted him in favor of a vision of a more open and integrative God, where everyone can follow their own conscience in their own choices and in their own words and actions. He abandoned the Jehovah's Witnesses' guilt-inducing and exclusive interpretation of the Bible with its 144,000 chosen people, even if it did continue to have a certain impact on him. He was more in favor of a more tolerant, educational, positive interpretation of religion that was compatible with a greater creative freedom. Nevertheless, this tolerance did not prevent him from quoting, in songs like Heal the World or Dangerous, biblical verses. It was during this period that he met Dr. Deepak Chopra, and that he wrote the book Dancing the Dream, which is a collection of poems that are closer to meditations or even parables. He focused on God, the creation, childhood, courage, love and hope in subtle texts where both current and timeless relevant issues, such as war or the environment, emerged. It illustrates a keen awareness of the world around him, even though he was often described as someone who was cut off from the world, or in a world of his own, disconnected from real life. It is therefore quite natural, then, that the Dangerous album be characterized by a very meditative form of spirituality that demonstrates a deep appreciation of the universe common to both Mark Ryden and Michael Jackson. They both frequently said that they felt like they were tools in the hands of God, guided by the subconscious or the magic of the moment and of Mother Nature that surrounded them. The references to the sacred and spiritual emerge in each of their respective works. However, they both managed to avoid dogmatisms by using a diversity of sources, and this suggests to us that fragments of truth can actually be found in all cultures and faiths. These references can be found through the numerous angels, evoking the revelation of St. John, one of the favorite texts of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The references can also be found with the presence of the animals waiting to be rescued, evoking another one of their favorite sacred texts, the flood, already used on the album Destiny by the Jacksons back in '78. Even the dog, disguised as Napoleon, can be seen in this image, since the Afghan hound is the only dog to have gone aboard Noah's Ark, according to tradition. Finally, these sacred references can be seen through the more subtle presence of a tomb, evoking the mausoleum of Henry II of Condé, created by Gilles Guérin. The thrones of the two human-like animals that dominate the picture on the left and on the right, the imperial dog and the monarch bird, are supported by columns extended by female statues supporting the entire structure. Seen as a whole, this arrangement makes us think of the caryatids of ancient times that stood in the place of columns in certain buildings. Each statue is distinct from the others in its form and its expression. But they all seem to be worried, angry, or in a solemn mood, and they symbolically hold an olive branch, a peace symbol, or the skull of a snake. Even if the mausoleum also makes its appearance in the music video of Leave Me Alone, with Elizabeth Taylor, on the basis of a rumor evoking Michael Jackson's devotion to the movie star, the general feeling of the painting dangerous evokes a world in destruction. It is related to the choice of these caryatids and justifies their choice. Finally, the spiritual dimension occupies an important place in the music of the album. A song like Will You Be There can be heard as a prayer that begins with an excerpt from Beethoven. Moreover, it is interesting to note that the verse chosen is not the most famous verse and is the only one that makes any mention to God amidst this ballad to brotherhood and to humanism. Here MG is echoing from another artist's artwork, just as Ryden refers to Ingres or Botticelli's art. Then, the next section of the song is a choir of synthetic voices, unearthly, like angels and children's voices singing a cappella in Renaissance choirs. This part of the music was composed by Michael Jackson in the spirit of Pergolese. The video accompanying the rest of the song, which is a prayer in gospel style, choreographed by Vincent Patterson, is full of religious symbolism, as we shall see. This song was also used as the soundtrack of the movie Free Willy, in line with Michael Jackson's interest for animals and nature conservation. The Dangerous album also deals with the question of power too. Media power, as we have seen through Barnum, but also political power and its inability to solve the social and environmental issues. This question is illustrated by the dominating presence of two strange characters, on the left and on the right of the album, who are staring at each other like statues. The first one is a cynocephalic portrayal of Napoleon, or a human body with a dog's head, based on Ingres' painting entitled Napoleon I on his imperial throne in 1806. And the second one is the official portrait of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, photographed by Cecil Beaton in 1952. If the use of a dog can be linked to the video of Leave Me Alone, where the journalists are caricatured in this way, it is also linked to its current exploitation in circuses. This dog is associated with Napoleon, but also with MG, since it's wearing a sparkling white glove, has black skin feet, and is wearing a sandal with the initials MG on it. The dog faces the diverted image of the Queen of England, whose symbol as a bird has a specific meaning. Indeed, birds are very visible in another inspiration for this painting, Hieronymus Bosch's triptych, which we are going to come back to shortly. Cecil Beaton is a photographer who shares Mark Ryden's taste for interconnections. The photographer is famous for his portraits of the royal family, celebrities, and the great names from history and from Hollywood movies, as here with Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, Greta Garbo, and George Platt. Some of his greater achievements worth noting include the portrait of Elizabeth Taylor that is actually shown in the music video of Leave Me Alone, and which contributed to the iconic status of the actress, who is a close friend of Michael Jackson. Let's come back to the music for a moment, to powerful famous people and their inabilities to solve social issues. We can notice how noise plays a major role in this album, which is very significant. The Bible associated noise with ritual murder and destruction, and history has always seen it as an instrument of power and a source of rebellion, unlike music, which can be considered as a succession of organized sounds and a means of building or strengthening a community. Michael Jackson always loved music for its capacity to operate a power of deep transformation and of pacification. Didn't he write on the back of the Triumph album in '80? Through the ages, the peacock has been honored and praised for its attractive, illustrious beauty. In all the bird family, the peacock is the only species that integrates all colors into one, and displays this radiance of fire only when in love. We, like the peacock, try to integrate all races into one through the love and power of music. So, admittedly, the angel musicians illustrated here are linked to biblical texts, and the animal musicians are linked to the circus. But the profusion of all these musical instruments and the central lyre at the bottom of the decor can be associated with the positive power of this music attributed by Michael Jackson. Therefore, throughout all civilizations, history has proven that there can be no power without noise control. Thus, following this train of thought, rap, which followed free jazz, was seen as announcing an explosion of urban violence. The same thing happened before and after with rock and roll, funk and hard rock as expressions of social chaos or rebellion. Even the new jack swing, with its metallic and computerized sounds, can be associated with the noises of an agitated society and is featured with other sounds in the Dangerous album. But Michael Jackson adds certain non-musical sounds as part of a transversal mixture that combines his instrumental and vocal music with other different types of noises that he was to develop further in his following album. From this point onwards, the noises go beyond mere theatrical sounds, as in Thriller, when you hear the creaky door opening and closing or the sound of footsteps, and they become an integral part of the music, like instruments in their own right, a common practice in contemporary art music, like in concrete music. Here is an example of this in the song She Drives Me Wild. Several songs evoke the question of ineffective power. This is the case, for example, in Why You Wanna Trip on Me, which in terms of sound uses muffled, saturated, echoing sounds, which is linked to social chaos and echoes. In much the same way, Mark Ryden's painting uses graphical saturation. What's more, the album, with the song Jam, opens with the sound of a glass shattering. It shows the awareness that Michael Jackson had of the impact of noise and of its original purpose, that of making people keep quiet, to capture their attention, and it's a signal for the audience to stop their chattering. The lyrics of this song propose to make up for the incompetence of politicians, calling upon every one of us to do something, each with our own particular talent and in our own particular field. Thus, Dangerous offers music and lyrics that specifically reflect their time in history. They were created in a turbulent period, colored by images of hope, but also by images of destruction, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the events in Tiananmen Square. George Bush came to power following a presidential campaign marked by the Willie Horton affair and a strengthening of the negative appearance of racial stereotyping in the US. Black or White, the first track to address head-on the issue of racism through a choreographic tour of the world, with a historical scenario of human morphing and the Panther sequence, putting the racist cliches that Afro-Americans have been subjected to for decades in the foreground. With Gone Too Soon, Michael Jackson raises the issues related to the presence of AIDS, the disease that affected Freddie Mercury, Magic Johnson, and also caused the death of the young Ryan White due to a blood transfusion, whose funeral costs were paid for by Michael Jackson. The chaos of the world is not only unique to our time in history. Its symbolism in the metaphor of Dangerous was greatly inspired by an earlier work of art, the Triptych of the Garden of Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Hieronymus Bosch was a painter from the late Middle Ages, 1450 to 1516, one of the most amazing artists in the history of Western culture. His extraordinary compositions, his strange settings, his bizarre monsters have never lost their power to fascinate. This master makes abundant use of symbols that are open to multiple interpretations. His similarity with Ryden is immediately apparent, as is the interest or the echo that connects the two of them across several centuries. Bosch sometimes appears as a devout Catholic, while at other times he appears as a precursor of the Reformation, as someone knowledgeable, or still at other times as an Adamite, a nudist heretic. Some people claim that his work falls strictly within the framework of the doctrine of the Church, while others consider it to be a source of occult wisdom. This combination of religious orthodoxy and the attraction to symbolism or esotericism was in another way known to be a common trend in this transitional period where the certainties of the Middle Ages were being brought into question. Bosch's work draws upon the atmosphere of heresy or disbelief and mysticism that were dominant during this time. Thus, he leans towards sacrilegious works where the believer has to confront sin and damnation. With merciless insight, he drops all his judgments in a society where the thirst for money and material possessions, pleasure and sin often triumph over everything else. His realism, often criticized, focused more on the psychological perception of the characters rather than on the accurate portrayal of objects and their material surface. And it is precisely this psychological aspect, added to the diversions and the imagination, that has made Bosch a source of inspiration for the Surrealists. The Triptych of the Garden of Delights is undoubtedly the most famous painting attributed to this artist. It was painted around 15. The Triptych of the Garden of Delights is undoubtedly the most famous painting attributed to this artist. It was painted around 1503-1504. Complex and enigmatic, it portrays on its inner surfaces Eden, left-hand side panel, the Garden of Delight, center panel, and Halle, right-hand side panel. In the closed position, the outside faces of the side panels depict the creation of the world. The subject of this triptych is primarily the theme of salvation, and it has a satirical dimension that seems to reflect on the spirit of the contemporary society in Bosch's time, and thus it announces the spirit of the Reformation. On the left hand, side open panel, Paradise is depicted in an atmosphere that is still peaceful and presents few curiosities. In the foreground, God introduces Eve to Adam. The Garden of Delight in the center shows a crowd of naked men and women who are indulging in all kinds of recreational activities, surrounded by birds and giant pieces of fruit. The chief scene shown here is lust, but there are also scenes of lethargy and gluttony, which in the medieval mind were two faults that originated from lust. The vision of hell on the right-hand panel is more carefully constructed than the visions of hell seen in other works by Bosch, such as the Haven or the Seven Deadly Sins. There is a juxtaposition here of abnormal objects, fires, demons, and the damned. As illustrated in the next slide, we can find in the Dangerous album the readaptation of some of the elements from the triptych. The closed side panels show a single subject painted in grayness, a terrestrial Earth-like sphere. The sphere looks as if it's both strong but fragile at the same time, like a crystal globe or a soap bubble in suspension in the dark space of the shadows. A text in Gothic lettering is printed above the sphere, announcing on the left-hand side of the panel, Ipse dixit et facta sunt, and on the right-hand side panel, Ipse mandavit et creata sunt, which are verses from the Psalms 32:9, speaking of the creation. He spoke, and it was created. He commanded, and it stood fast. The overall appearance of the bubble on Bosch's closed triptych can be seen as a parallel to the world tree called Yggdrasil. This notion of the world tree is an archetype referring back in several mythologies to the existence of a cosmic tree connecting the different parts of the universe, generally the celestial, terrestrial, and underground worlds, and there are plenty of graphic parallels. This bubble containing the cosmic tree appears again in the form of the topsy-turvy world, positioned in the dark heart of the album cover of Dangerous, as we will see in the next slide, and it is also placed here, the place where the worlds of giants, humans, and the underworld all merge into one. Moreover, Ryden presents a cross-section of all imaginable human forms. The nature and the diversity of these forms, rich, poor, adults, children, handicapped, men, women, androgynous, white, black, anthropomorphic, or human-like forms, combined with the presence of many animals, takes and transposes the iconographic style of the landscape of the world which was characteristic of the late Middle Ages. The landscape of the Garden of Delight seemed to illustrate these on the scale of earth. For Bosch, the idyllic vision of paradise with its first creatures is counterbalanced by the vision of fighting and scenes of cruelty that lead to death in the form of physical and moral destruction. And it is precisely this struggle pushed to the extremes by the establishment, that this individual struggle for survival, both human and animal, through power, childhood and death, that we find in the painting of Dangerous. Finally, another avenue explored is the way in which Bruegel the Elder (1525 to 1569) enjoyed transposing moral and didactic proverbs, puns, verbal metaphors, and even a few quotes from well-known popular songs of his day into images. This can be illustrated in the painting The Flemish Proverbs, where he deals with all these subjects in this one painting. There are over 100 proverbs and sayings in it. It's a pre-encyclopedic approach that was used in those days. In fact, collections of proverbs are featured among the 16th century's numerous catalogues. This practice can be found in Rabelais' Gargantua, 1534, where there is a passage giving a long list of card games, and also in another painting by Bruegel, in his Children's Games in 1560. These snapshots and visual images find a similarity with the painting Dangerous. They correspond to the message that they are proverbs that are simultaneously more universal or more spiritual. To illustrate these, we can start with these unmasked eyes of Michael Jackson that dominate the painting Dangerous because of their size and their central position. These look behind the scenes, to draw a first parallel with the popular saying, is emphasized by the central and the dominant proportions of the eyes. It also reminds us of the title of one of Michael Jackson's songs, Behind the Mask, during the Thriller era. Taking into consideration that Michael Jackson was deeply influenced by the religious and spiritual devotion to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and never hesitated to quote verses from the Bible in his songs, the eyes can be interpreted as an illustration of the phrase from Isaiah, "Your eyes will see the King in his beauty. They will behold the far distant land." A similar reference, in terms of symbolism and representation, can be found in the eyes on the cover illustration of Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby. These spiritual eyes, presented as a giant advertisement and said to belong to Dr. T.G. Eckleburg, are symbolic of a presence, an omniscient eye. For this novel, just as much as for the album cover of Dangerous, the eyes are a stable point of reference in the midst of chaos and emptiness that replaces God. In one instance, it's a billboard, and in other instance, it's an artist who is the target of all eyes and all criticism, capable, in spite of everything, of judging the scene he is observing. Other proverbs, quotation or hidden song titles include Heal the World. This song is of course about curing a sick world. Jam, in the sense of traffic jam, blockage, as can be seen in the saturation of images in the painting. Also, the song is an invitation for people to turn their attention toward world's problems rather than toward artists' private lives. We are dwarfs on the shoulders of giants. To hold the world in the palm of one's hand. A topsy-turvy world. Black or white. The monarch bird. The imperial dog. To his dog every man is Napoleon. And, seen as a whole, the picture appears to be a great Barnum, or the greatest show on earth, the title of Barnum's show, and also of a song Michael Jackson sang as a child. In short, a world in which we must never judge a book by its cover. We have seen some of the aspects that make the album cover artwork of Dangerous a rich work of art, able to reach out to every type of audience, highly sophisticated or less sophisticated. Everyone can play the game of deciphering and understanding different parts of it. The same is true of Michael Jackson's music, which is full of eclectic allusions in terms of style, from classical to rap through jazz, music hall, R&B, heavy metal, mixing profane music with religious, with gospel music, popular music with classical music, with Beethoven, and which, far from a commercial perspective, reflects above all a spirit and an open-mindedness towards all cultures and all music with a capital M. This visual and musical work of Dangerous display a great cultural diversity with its sources in the popular arts, pop music, videos, pop art, but also in the fine arts, Bosch, Botticelli, Guérin. It extends the concept of the painting even to touch on architecture and is an alliance between an item for mass consumption, the album cover, and the work of an artist, the artwork itself. For Michael Jackson, music has always been a vehicle for peace, a vibration of universal harmony, along with dance, which he has created in an equally transcultural style to combine hybrid movements, sometimes borrowing from military gestures, where he has invigorated these movements with grace, and then turned them into a corporal language of peace. Music and dance are some of the means by which he conveys a real ecological dimension. The music and dance are both essential, and we can see this by all the aesthetic care he puts into them. However, even more important than just the environmental issues, he provides with his music and dance a positive vibration which affects our whole world, our human and global world. It is in this regard that I would like to close this talk, or rather to let it close, with Michael Jackson's voice and a poem written and recorded by him during the period when he recorded Dangerous, and which will conclude this work with grace, sincerity, and emotion, and a very deep message: Planet Earth.
Planet Earth, my home, my place.